around for quite some time. So you see quite a lot of resources of Firebase 8 online. Also, do not use Firestore. Right? Do not use Firestore unless you are familiar, because your Unity will need to use it too. All right, so let's cover a few parts. So let's see here. So for CA submission, I'm missing quite a few. Arun was around last week, so please try and catch up. Leon, Sunny, Yishen, I thought you were all right with this portion. Same for Leon. Anyway, if you have any issues, let me know.
What was I supposed to do then?
Just simple connecting with your Firebase using HTML and JavaScript. So that was the last part of last week. Yeah.
Can I still submit?
Yeah, must do.
Not anything at this point, really.
Okay, so I want to recap about OOP. Some of you had a few wrong ideas. All right, so in terms of how we deal with objects is quite crucial, because we're going to work around with objects quite a fair bit in JavaScript, and also in Unity we work with it using classes to work with objects. So in JavaScript, there's no, like, say, hard classes. They have, but it's going to confuse a couple of you guys. So the easier way will be we deal with simple objects and function-based objects. So literal objects are like very simple objects that we deal with. We can't reuse the template. That means, let's see. Oh, wait. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So we can't like keep creating this same layout every time or not. All right, it is stuck to this variable. Right, this is a variable, and then we assign all these values to it. So this is an object. So how do we know? Any curly braces that we see, that's an object. All right, any square bracket, that's an array. Okay. So in an object, we have all these properties in red, and we have all these values in green. All right. Because we are dealing with Firebase, we try not to have arrays in our objects when possible. You can have, it's just whether you get confused, because they'll be stored into your Firebase data. They won't directly store as an array. They will create an index. So it'll be 0 will be assigned to twin, 1 will be assigned to suite, 2 will be assigned to deluxe, and so on. All right, so slightly different. Okay, so the next thing is when we are accessing an object, we can just use the dot notation or the square bracket notation. And the other thing is when we are updating an object, we just assign a value to it, whichever property that I want to work around with. So be it using dot notation or square notation. All right, both are the same. The other thing about having objects, we can have like a constructor way, in the sense like we use the keyword new. All right, when we say new something, that means we are creating an object in the space. So in this sense, we are creating an empty object. There's no format to it. We are assigning the format later on. All right, so all this dot notation, we are assigning all these different properties in red, and assigning all the values to it. All right. The other part which is much better to use is we use a function-based object notation. So in this sense, we can always keep reusing hotel. All right, whenever we say new hotel 1 or new hotel That means 2 equals to new hotel, 3 equals to new hotel, and so on. We can assign all these values, all right, because our function hotel has these parameters, right? So we are accepting all these parameters coming in, and then inside that function we assign properties, all right? So the keyword this will give it to this particular object that you create later, all right? So this is assigned whichever time that you create the object itself, all right? Then of course we assign the values. You can have internal function, all right? So that's up to you. This internal function will not be stored into Firebase. All right, Firebase just stores hard values, that's all. All right, so I was saying the keyword new. All right, so the new hotel creates this particular new object in the space, and then we can assign the properties whenever we want. Okay. So when we come back to our exercise and look into it, let me just show you an example that I think this is by Jordan's team. All right. So during your submission, you should have submitted your JSON file. All right. So his JSON has a couple of things: players, player stats, and leaderboards. All right. And the C# file. All right. So we have our class, all the different properties, and all the constructor. Let me just paste in the chat. So it's easier. By the way, all the slide decks and sample codes has been in the GitHub repo already. All right. So this is a typical class that you see in C#. Right. And when we shift to the JavaScript version, initially Jordan's team had some errors. So he was doing this, right, which is quite wrong. So what I meant by wrong means this is fine. You give a variable, then assign it to an object. But when it comes to a property and a value, the value is wrong. The value should be some value that you decide. All right. So maybe decide to be Jordan or things like that. So this is the correct format that you should be keying in. So those are hard values. There's no template to it. It's just a hard object. We want to give it values so that we can use leaderboard. So the moment we do this, we can actually use the dot notation to give us a name or high score or speed and so on. All right, so we can do this even. Okay, so be it the bracket notation or the dot notation, doesn't matter. Right. Another thing to note, some students were having repeated naming. So this leaderboard will be in their function-based method. So that's repeated. So try not to do that. All right. The other thing, because this is just a variable name, so try not to confuse your variable name with your function names. So this is fine. So this is a player account. He gave all these parameters. And then he gave assign all the parameters to the properties inside. So whenever we create a new object, all right, so say let player account data. So this is our variable. It goes to new player account, and then we assign all the different variable values inside. And how we can access the values? We can access in this format. Okay. Another thing that he did here is he has this new date time. He assigned it to US time slot. So you can actually change your locale, that is the location of your time. It doesn't really matter. More like when you are storing, just store it as a timestamp without any location advantage. But depends on you. So the moment we start converting, you should convert for all. All right. And that's about it. So that was literal objects over here, right, and our function-based objects. So when we map it to our C#, so let me fire up another one. So when we put it into C#, and let's see, leaderboard, no, let's go for clear cut. All right, so it's very, very similar. You have all your properties over here, all your properties, right? And then your function name. So it's mapping to this. All right, so this is replicated over here. Your properties, or rather this is replicated over here. All right. Okay. Yishen, so main thing to get a point is understand how do we create objects, be it function-based objects or be it literal objects. So this is from ID. So we are trying to do a recap that. All right. Okay, so the next thing is how we deal with reading of data in Firebase with JavaScript. So the basic concept is this: we need our required imports. All right, and this deals with the database import. So this is retrieving from the SDK. This is from Firebase SDK, and it says version 9.x over here, and then we retrieve the database service. From there, we decide which kind of imports do we want. All right, and the key part is here when we want to retrieve the entire database service that we have. Right, so the moment we say get database as a function, we can work around it. So it's like initializing the database first. Then we decide, do we want to create a path? All right. Then the next thing that we have is we can create a function, or we can just call our get command. Let me just come back to here. So our get, right, is the same as get values async in C#. So we get all the values in this particular reference. So the moment I execute this, and if everything is okay, this entire snapshot on the left, bottom left of players will get returned back into snapshot. So this portion, all right, will get returned to snapshot. And if there's any data, I will decide. So if it exists, if there's data, then I try and execute out my loop. So my loop is just looping around all the char. So this for each will just loop each object that I have, right? It starts on here and goes around looping around all this. Okay. If there's any error, then I catch. And that's about it. This is for retrieving objects in our Firebase. All right. One of the good things is we have a little command called .key, so it allows us to retrieve the key of that snapshot itself. Okay. The next one is when we are talking about creating users. So create users, same thing. We have our imports, but this time is with the authenticate service. So always remember, when we deal with authenticate, it is different from dealing with your database. All right. So when we deal with our authentication, we have our get auth, create user. We could also have sign in with email and password. So once we are ready, we say constant auth equals to get auth. So it's very similar to how we do with database. When we say get database, just get database, that's all. Right, so the imports are very important. If not, JavaScript will start complaining, hey, why are you calling a function that doesn't exist? All right. So the next couple of things is how we deal with our form. All right. So say create forms and all that. So in my UI HTML, I have a form. I get element by ID. So this is just my form's ID. All right, and I'm just listening on a submit button. Right, in a form itself, you can only have one submit button, but we can actually assign different buttons and give it click. So later I'll show you the example of how we use clicks instead of submits. All right. So we prevent the default action of our submit button, and then we retrieve all the different values of our form itself. Right, from there, same thing. Whenever we create a user, let's say create user with email and password, we send in our authenticate object, and we are done. The good thing about when we are creating an user, it sort of signs in for us at the same time. All right, and then it says it returns the user's credentials. User's credential means our user ID, right? Our email, anything that relates to the user's profile, right? So this is the same as your C# version. Okay. So next thing is I want to talk about how we can deal with forms and all that, and how you can actually start setting up as a base. So last week we did it in sort of all in one script. So it's good to separate your scripts out. So what I'm saying is how we start with our project. So you have your project folder, you could have your JavaScript folder, your CSS folder, and so on and so on. All right. So what I have is a config.js file. In it, it just does the import of initializing in the app. All right, our Firebase config. You can fill in your own Firebase config, and then we initialize the application. This is the very first script that you need to run. All right, this is the very first script that you need to run your Firebase. The next thing is whichever script that you want to run is maybe your authenticate, maybe your database. This is part 2. All right. Then only in part 3, then we start setting up our HTML. All right. You can set up our event listeners and so on. So I'll show you my code, sample code of what I meant. So in the GitHub, you probably see quite a number of things. So in my version, I have this config file. I never include into the GitHub. All right. So I have my config file. It does the initialization. It does the Firebase config. All right. You can retrieve this from your project overview, and then you initialize. So this is step 1. Step 2 is when, like say, when we want to authenticate. All right. So we authenticate. We import in the authenticate service. You could have your database service also. So whichever service that you want to bring in, just call on the script, right? And then just call on whichever service that you want to use. So then we set them up, right? We have our initialized app already, so it's going to work. All right. This is done. Then we set up our retriever of our UI. All right, so we get element by ID, whichever way they want to do with. Then we set up our event listeners. So here I already assign from my get element by ID, I'm retrieving this button. All right, I add event listener. That means I'm waiting for something to happen. What's going to happen is on click. So the moment I click on this button, something is going to happen with the function. All right, I'm going to execute this function. So if we retrieve the values in my form, and I'll just call sign up user. All right. In my HTML, let me just show you the HTML. So in HTML, the first few things that we usually put in is your additional things, more like your jQuery or your Bootstrap. So here I just put in my jQuery and Bootstrap and so on. All right, I'm using the local version. That means this is stored into my folder. All right, you can use the Bootstrap CDN version, which is derived from online. All right. The next thing I will do, I'll first look in the config file. So make sure you look in your config. And the key thing is here. You want it to be a type of a module, module.js file. The reason is because of the imports. The way that the imports are doing is a modular format. All right, so it's only importing certain chunks of the JavaScript file only. Okay, so we need this keyword called type equals module. Next, I import whichever JavaScript file that I want to deal with. Of course, you can combine this file into a main file. Maybe just a main.js file, right? So that's up to you. I just separate them out so it's easier for you guys to see which kind of code relates to what. Right. The next thing, then I set up my form. So I have my form ID over here. I have my different IDs for my inputs. That means my text box. Okay, let me change the type. Okay, my password and so on. All right, so I have different buttons. All right, I don't have a submit. I don't have input type with submit. I do not have that. Instead, I have buttons only. I assign a button ID, and I will tag on to this button ID later. So in the, let's come back to the event listener. So in the event listener, this part is tagged to that. All right. Let me show you what I meant. So this button sign up is tagged on to here. All right. How I did it is just a simple get element by ID. This part. So this one, get element by ID, will help me to retrieve this entire thing. So this HTML element will be assigned to this, will be assigned to this variable, and from there, then I just retrieve out the values, or I can assign it to an event listener. All right. So 3 key parts on how you can set up the JavaScript portion. All right. So file okay. I will assume everyone's all right. So for those who haven't done up the CA, please get it done. All right. It's very important. The next thing is we're going to talk about jQuery a little bit. All right, and jQuery can simplify your selections quite a fair bit. Some people prefer it, some people don't. So I'm just doing a recap. So all the how to say, all the previous ID slide decks have been placed into the GitHub also. So it's under week 7 for there's jQuery and there's also Bootstrap. Right. So for jQuery, whenever we do jQuery, it's just the $ notation, and we can assign be it a class or be an ID or be a HTML tag. So we want to search our HTML for a certain part because we want to modify it. And what do we want to do? We can show and hide, or we can give it CSS, or we can get the values. So there's many things that we can do with just this alone. All right. So how do we select HTML text? Simply just put in your HTML tag, right? Be it a div, be it a paragraph, and so on. That simplifies with as compared to our normal JavaScript. The other part is when we deal with IDs, so it's the hash tag notation. Then else is classes using dot, right? So depending on how you want to select. Typically, when we deal with database, we might just use hashtag. So we use IDs. It's a lot faster and easier. The only thing to make sure is you only have one ID of that name in the entire HTML. All right. So other good benefits is when we are updating HTML content or content alone in the HTML itself. All right, we can just use .html and key in our HTML values. So when we think back in terms of how we retrieve data from our database, we retrieve and display into our console last week, right? So now it's time to display into our HTML. So using just .html, our HTML can be updated with our variables that's coming back, our content that's coming back from our database. All right, let me see if I can show you what I meant. Let me just jump to reading. So like say, for example, I'm updating my HTML over here. So every time it loops, all right, I keep having all this HTML content. And at the end, I will pump it into my HTML. Okay. So you can use appending method, or you can use one-time update method. So that's up to you on how you want to design your interactions with HTML and JavaScript. All right. So other things is we can use attributes, HTR, that will allow us to change or update the different attribute values or retrieve the attribute values. All right. The other key thing is whenever we have JavaScript, jQuery commands, we should use document.ready. That will make sure our jQuery is safe to go. So some key parts is how do we insert in which portion. So other than using modifying through a particular ID, right, we can actually do a little bit of design. So either before a HTML tag or prepend it in that content, append, or after the tag itself. So whenever I assign that portion, so whichever portion that you want to assign, see whether it looks up fine. So I'm targeting, let's say, in my list, this portion. So I can either do it before, prepend, append, or after. All right, so that depends on how you want to insert your content. All right, the key thing is how we, at which part is the starting point. So the starting point is here, this particular tag itself. All right. The next thing is working with event handlers. The normal JavaScript way is a little bit troublesome. We have to retrieve a particular ID and an event listener, assign what kind of event to happen to wait on, then assign a function. All right. If you are fine with it, then that's fine. The key thing is here, whenever we are dealing with more values. So in jQuery's version, we can actually simplify it. So we just call whichever portion that we want. All right. So same thing here, our ID, username. All right. On what event, then we execute our function. All right. It works the same, just which one is cleaner for you to operate on. All right. Let's see what else we have. Okay, the other thing is selecting inputs from using jQuery. All we have to do is just either you use IDs to select, all right, or you can actually use our input and then the name equals to something. So in our form, so typically in our forms, all right, so on my right here is my form. So we could have a name equals to let's say password. All right. So other than from using IDs, forms or inputs have a certain extra thing, which is you can give it a name. All right. The name comes in much more detailed when you are using a checkbox group or when you're using a radio button group. So in radio buttons and in checkbox, the name is the same. All right. So the naming, so let's say I'm having a checkbox here. in order to know that they belong to a group, right, I will have to give it the same name. Okay, so in order to know that I'm in the same group, I have to give it the same name. The IDs can be different, but the name must be the same. So at one shot, if I'm retrieving all the values in that group, right, it gives me an array of values. This part is slightly different. So when we are retrieving from values, we can use .val, right? In JavaScript, in normal JavaScript, we use .value. Let me see. So in normal JavaScript, on the right, we are using .value for a form that we want to retrieve, or we use .val. All right, .val is in jQuery. These are depending on event handling. So drop-down menus we use on change event handling. So when the drop-down menu changes, you're selecting different things, we can actually change our UI or call different functions. The additional benefits with dealing with jQuery is actually the effects that we can use. So simple show and hide, toggling between show and hide, fading effects, right? So when you have new content you want to show to the user, there should be a short transition, all right, or a change in colors depending on how you want to do it, right? That very short transition, we will get a little bit triggered so that we know something is happening to our data, all right? So sliding effects also we can do, simple delay, animation effects. So other than all these effects that jQuery provides, we can also use other animation scripts. So that's to your liking. So animate.css allows us to do that also. The use of it is very straightforward. All we have to do is just assign a class to it, right? Add in a CSS class, and then it will do what is required to do the animation, all right? So there's many different effects. They're all very similar to what you see on PowerPoint, all right? Okay, so this is the part. Everyone okay or not? Or everyone there? Let's do a check-in. Let's see whether you are there. Let's see, check this. Not too bad, we have 10 people. So 2 are missing. All right, so the next part is reading of information, more into dealing with how we work with our Firebase data with HTML and JavaScript. So this is the part where I want you all to try later already. All right. So dealing with CRUD is very similar to how we do it with Unity. The only key differences are how we call it, as in the syntax is different. So instead of get values async, we just use get. The player reference instead of database reference, you can just call ref. So how in JavaScript it's very short form, I would say. All right. So it's very short form. There's no long wording of it. Just get, and that's about it. All right. The other thing, so I just go through the code over here and I'll explain what's going on. So the first thing, of course, we do our imports. So every time you deal with Firebase, you must have your imports. All right, so you have your imports, whichever function that you want to use, and where are you getting it from, right? Then we get our database, reference to our path if you want. All right, then retrieve our different elements. Or for me, I set up my event listener. All right, so I retrieve my element. At the same time, I add an event listener to it. So it's waiting for someone to click. All right, and once someone click on the button, I will retrieve out all this, execute this function. I'll get all the data and player reference, and it will return me a snapshot. So that is effectively our callback. Or in JavaScript sense, that's our promise. All right, so you send something over a command and then they will send you something back. All right. If it exists, if some data exists, then I will try and do a loop. So what this loop does, I will look through all the data and then I will retrieve the value. So for each property inside the char itself, right, I will access it and then I will take the value out. This part is sort of more troublesome because in C# we don't really use .char to access the value. We just access the value straight away. All right. So what I'm saying is this. Let me just show you the Firebase. So when we are comparing data side by side, right? Every time we retrieve a snapshot, so the first thing we retrieve a snapshot of players. We do a loop of all these nodes. All right, so I have many different char inside. It varies in terms of data. The key will retrieve the key over here, those in dark gray. Right, and then I will get a char. So these are all treated as char. All right. So .char, the value, sorry, the property and the value. So I want to retrieve the property username over here, and I want to retrieve out the value, and so on. All right. So there's other few things that we can play with is how do we know how many char are there, right? So how do we know in our snapshot how many children we have, or char nodes, so to speak, right? So it's simply just snapshot.size that will retrieve our size of the entire snapshot that we have. That means it will go and count what's our size that's returned to us. In C#, it's more like num of children. All right. In JavaScript, they don't have that. And let me just work on this. All right. So the other thing is when we want to convert it into a timestamp, we can always use this. Right. Play with our dates if you want. So later in your CA, you do reading with HTML. So I'll show you how an example of what it will look like first. So this is my let's say Firebase and it's connected already. So I want to retrieve all players. So the moment I click on this button, I have my event listener set up. I will retrieve all my data from Firebase. And you can see it's quite fast actually. All right, so the more I click, all the data gets retrieved. I can, using the size, I can get the size of the data that's coming back. All right. Of course, additionally, we can have edit functions, delete, and so on. So this is in terms of reading. Right, the next thing is about creating. So whenever we are creating users or creating data in Firebase, it's even more straightforward as compared to reading, right? Because we just put in values, that's all. All right. So when we talk about setting or creating new information, we use the keyword set over here, and whichever reference that we want, our database object, all right, and our path. Then we insert in our data. So our data is in the form of an object, right? So we are inserting basically the literal object exercises that you all have did previously, all right? Or you can use your function-based object and just throw in the new object inside, right? Once we are ready with the data, we can just call set, our reference path, and then our data that we want to put in. That's about it, all right? So that's how creation works. And let me just show you what I meant. So for me, I have this simple example over here, and let me just show you what happens when we do with Firebase. Let's go Firebase. All right, so I have all my players. Let's delete some data first. So the moment I'm deleting, I can see there's updates in my UI. All right, so I delete one more. See, it's instantaneous updates. I don't need to refresh my HTML file, and I'll explain why very soon. All right. So for me, in this example, right, my creation is fixed. That means I'm creating a random player. Right. In your exercise later, use a form to retrieve the values, then create the player. Right. So the moment I create a player, I will update this UI. Right. So I create my player, and my UI gets updated. My database gets updated also. All right. So that's how, in terms of asynchronous, it works. That means it sort of runs super real time. Right. You send the data, you update my UI. That's about it. All right. So when you are deploying this across to multiple users, right? So maybe this is my HTML. This is me using. So when you're deploying it to, you have this URL and you give it to many different people, right? All their data, their dashboard will be updated at the same time. So whenever, like say in-game in your Unity, for example, a new player enters, or maybe there's a new high score, right? The leaderboard gets updated. All your data in your website gets updated at the same time too. So everyone that's accessing that leaderboard page, they will see new changes in their interface itself. All right. And let me just jump into the creation portion. So how does that real-time effect work? All right, so first thing, I'll just run through how we set things up. We set things up by calling database, right? That's our imports. Get database, right? Step 1 and step 2, we reference. And step 3, we add our event listeners, and we access our buttons. So I'm just accessing my create button. Inside my create button, I just create a very fixed user. All right, so in your version, you should be using a form to create that user, not this fixed version. All right. The next thing, we set up our database to create new information. And where do we create? We reference it. The key thing is here. Right, our path should be a new one, which is based on our user ID. All right, it should not be based on players itself, unless you are pushing your own new key. Right, so for me, I'm using a very fixed user ID, which is time. All right, for you, you should be using your authentication ID. That means the new user's user ID. Then we pump in our data. So you see player data gets inserted. All right. Technically, there's no callback mechanism. Right, that means there's nothing sent back to you. Firebase doesn't send anything back unless it's an error. Right, so I just call then as the empty function, and that means once it enters here, I know my data is saved properly. All right. If there's an error, then I try and print out those errors. So the dynamic part that happened earlier is depending on this function called onValue. So onValue, in the imports, I will put in onValue. So anytime when the data in players, right, because of my players reference, in players, anytime my players data gets updated, new data gets inserted, new data is, data is deleted, data is updated, right? I will, this onValue will just listen to it. Whenever there's any form of changes, I'm waiting for those changes, right? If there is a change, and only when there's a change, I will get a snapshot back. Only when there's a change in the reference data. All right, I'll get a snapshot back, and I will I'll call my function. Of course, you can do whatever you want in this part. So always think like, hey, something changed, what should I do? All right, what do I want to show the users? What do I want to display? What do I want to update? All right. Think about what you want to display, update to users. All right. For me, I just call a simple update player content, which updates the entire table itself. All right. So this is just the same as my reading. So this just reads through my entire HTML, goes through, it looks through, and then updates my interface. All right. And then I assign it back to my HTML content, update my HTML content, update my total player size. All right. So that's how you make things very real time, very dynamic in nature. And let me just put it over here. Right, so I was saying about on the keyword onValue earlier. It's actually listening to data. So this is Firebase documentation. So it just reads and listens for changes to the entire contents of a path. So anytime this path data changes, all right, I will want the latest snapshot. So with that snapshot, I can do a lot of things already. Right, I can show some updates to the users. All right. So in the next CA, this is to create your form to create data using set. All right. Once a form is submitted, please process it. You can further optimize your code. Think about all the validation that you have to do. Empty values. What you should think about. Are you using the correct input types? Right. You can also use Bootstrap and jQuery to make it easier. All right, or nicer. Just choose one main reference node. Right. This is very important in terms of how we work with your assignment 2. Right. So in your assignment 2, you should have some form of creation, reading, update, or delete. A little bit of dashboarding in terms of how you do your assignment 2. All right. This is a group exercise within your group that you created for your assignment 2. All right. Let me just, okay, yeah. Everyone got it for the CA? Everyone understands what the CA requires to emote? If you don't have your previous CA, you can work with your team on how to do the previous CA also. All right. Yishen, you can one. Yeah, if you can't, then when you are stuck at somewhere, then you ask. All right, I want you all to try first. So the GitHub has a lot of the sample codes already. So this is all pushed to Git. All right, simple sign up, simple creation. All right. Okay, to save a little bit of time, so we can add some buffer for group for your assignment pitch later. I will continue. So seems like everyone's okay. This might be a little bit tricky for some. All right. All right, so the next thing is I want to talk about authentication. When we deal with authentication, the thing about authentication in Firebase, the moment you are signed in, you are persisted. That means you will not be signed out until you say you want to sign out. Until you click on the sign out function, then you are signed out. Else you are sort of forever signed in. All right, very similar to a lot of the mobile apps that we use today. The moment we are signed in, more or less, we are like forever signed in, unless they do a application update or they sign you out forcefully, things like that. Or maybe due to some privacy, they might sign you out 14 days later or 28 days later, things like this. Otherwise, most mobile apps especially, you are sort of signed in for sort of forever lah. All right. One of the key things is they want ease of access, better user experience. All right. The next thing in dealing with authentication, right? So earlier we have on value change. On value, that means any kind of value change in the reference path, right? Then we're going to have on state change for our authentication. So this is very useful to detect whether the user is logged in or logging out, right? So if the user is logged in, all right, I can always retrieve his user ID and can do a lot of things with it. I can, hide my UI. I can hide my registration form. I can hide my sign-in form. So if he's logged in already, I do not need to show him the forms again. All right. The next thing that we can do is if he's not logged in, then I show back the forms. Right. So it's quite straightforward. So what it needs is just a auth object. That means our authentication object. And then it will return you the current user. I just put here current user because it just makes sense to name it that way, because it returns our promise. I just put here explicitly, the naming doesn't matter. All right, so you can name it anything that you want. It's just that it returns the current user's credentials. All right, so it will retrieve like display name, profile pic, and so on. But if the user doesn't have a display name assigned or profile pic assigned, then you will show a null value. That means there's no value attached to it. So let's see. So for example, I sign up a new user. Right? So he sign up, my forms gets hidden. Of course, in my code, I will hide the forms if he's logged in. Then if I ever come in again, I do a refresh, right? The form is always hidden for me. Right, I sign up, the form comes back in. Okay. So depending on how you want to do your so-called user experience. So how do we define persistence? By default, it's always persistent, unless we state other ways of persistence. So this kind of always login effect is called persistence. All right. So by default, Firebase will take in as a local persistence. That means it will always be persistent. Even when your browser window is closed, my tab is closed, I open up again, it's always logged in. Okay. Other than that, I could have a session-based. Session-based persistence, that means you are only logged in when the tab is there. If I close my tab, I'm sort of logged out already. All right. The other one, there's no persistence. I can only log in and then see my data. The moment I change my URL or things like that, I no longer log in. Okay, so we can actually modify our persistence level. And let me just show you how we can do it. So I have this HTML that says sign in persistence, and this JavaScript file. So there's 3 different persistence level. All right, one is session based, just the current tab. Persist all the way until all right. Browser local persistence and in memory. That means there's no form of persistence. How we change that persistence is very simple. We just say set persistence or authentication and our authentication type. So we just call browser local persistence or our browser session persistence or in memory. So there's these 3 that we can use. All right. So what it means in our today's context, in a lot of sign up buttons, in a lot of sign up forms, we have a checkbox called Remember Me. All right. If I check on Remember Me, I should be using local persistence. That means it should be logged in forever. I should remember him. If we are not doing that, then we should swap to session persistence. That means it's logged onto this current usage only. So the moment I close the tab, I close my window, right? He is logged out, right? It's not stored into the browser anymore. All right, so that's the key parts. How we see in today's context. Very seldom we see no persistence. All right, very, very seldom. So it's either local persistence or session-based persistence. The same thing happens, we get authentication. We just swap our authentication type. Right, so before we log in or in between, right, we can set our persistence. So for me, I just set my persistence first. Right, then I log him in. Okay, so these are other things that I want to bring up in terms of how we see in today's context. Okay, the other thing is with imports, this is just a reminder of imports. Make sure you're importing the correct thing. So far, we are just using these 3 different services. One is application, one is database, one is authenticate. Right, and all these different imports are the current ones we are using or will be using. All right, so persistence, sign in, sign up, all right, database, get, set, char on value, initializing of the application. All right, and let me see. Yeah, this is one of the few last things that I want to talk about, which is indexing. So when we talk about indexing, is we want to optimize our data further. All right, you have done, our keys are sort of unique in nature. We cannot have a duplicate key. But say like I'm storing data in my database, right? I'm storing all the information. I could be storing like your IC. Your NRIC is very unique in nature, right? You're the only one with the same with the NRIC number, right? But it's not used as a key. But I want it to function like a key to the database. I know it's sort of unique. I want the data to be retrieved more efficiently, right? So what we do is we can set an index on that key itself. All right. So the index will sort of compile our data nicely, so that it's a lot more efficient to retrieve that data. All right. So if your data accumulates more and more, right, it's good to choose what kind of values do I want to index. All right. So I say index on. So there's a dot here, index on, and then that particular property that I want to index, and that's about it. Okay. And the last thing I want to talk about is working with dashboards. So you can actually start thinking about how you want to do your dashboards, especially for even simple player context. You can have number of users sign up today, right? Then you can chart it across 7 days, 14 days, 20 days, and so on. Or number of users who actually touch the application today. So when we think in today's game context, right, a lot of games today, they have a lot of different gamification methods. And one of the most common one is they ask you to check in the application every day, get some free currency. All right. To a developer, to a company, this is very important. They want to see how active their users are. Of course, the higher the activity, the better. The next thing they want to see it across 7 days. Have you been trying to touch my application in 7 days, 14 days, a month? Because why we say this kind of time span? Because how loyal are your customers? How loyal are your users, your gamers? All right. Because with that, they have to think about how to market, how to attract these users back, how to hook on campaigns like your sales, your loot. You play games, there's a lot of loot sales and so on. How do we attract them into different competitions and things like that? All right. So that kind of data is quite crucial. So for example, this is what I got from online. This is all the VR game activity, how active players are on all these VR games. Right, current number of users, what's the peak like, what's the maximum number of users at that point of time, and on average in 1 day, how many users are touching the game. All right, so this is quite interesting. And then they say the total number of players online right now. All right, because remember, as long as we can actually detect when they sign in, then we can do a log of it. So next thing is we can also see like this chart says the game data, right, how active they are across over time, right? You can do comparison charts. Of course, we can compare with last month or so. All right, so that depends on you. So there's additional useful comparison data. So in terms of in the VR game itself, right, data like this, total, these are like your player stats, right? What's your leaderboard ranking? What's my win percentage, and so on. All right, total games played and things like that. The other one is this is box VR, and like exercise VR game. All right, it shows instead of the number of jabs, number of blocks. So in the exercise, you did all this. They show you a percentage instead. All right. So different ways to display data. One is hard numbers, one is percentages. Right. Very common data is also the streaks. What's your running hit rate? Things like this. All right. So this is quite fun to work with in your VR also. And let's say in terms of dashboarding, we can use chart.js. Right, so I'll show you the example, then I'll explain. Let's go to, where is my charts? All right, so I have my charts that I retrieved from my Firebase. Let me see my Firebase. No, I don't have Firebase. And put it side by side. So here I have some sample data of my daily active users. All right, all I did was key in the days. Right, so these are a lot of the days that I have. So the moment if he's playing or touching my game on that day itself, I will assign a value true based on his user ID. All right, so on different days, you know, there's different number of users, and then I create my chart like this. All right, and from there, as a manager or my game company, I can see, hey, how active they are. Why are they? Why is the low on a weekday, or is it a low on a weekend? All right, so you can do it across different time slots also. So that's up to you on how you want to show that kind of data. All right. In terms of code, it's more or less the same. We have our imports and our UI. The key thing is when we are retrieving, then I retrieve out the dates. I want to form my x-axis, all right, based on the days. I want to form my y-axis based on the number of players on that day. So what I did is the number of players depends on the number of entries in that chart itself. So to get the number of entries, I just use .size. Right, that will give me the number of char entries. All right, to retrieve the day on that day, which day it is, I just use .key. That will give me the day. So that gives me the x-axis. Size gives me the y-axis. All right. To create the chart, you have chart.js inserted. There are just a few simple commands that you need to know. Where do you want to reference your chart? So for me, I'm just referencing based on my get element by ID. And I give it my chart. All right. Then I call this standard new chart command. This is very standard. All right. There's nothing special about it. It's just like a template. Then we fill in all the different options that I want. I can give it a line chart, a bar chart, whichever chart that I want. Right. Then I insert in my x-axis, which is my labels, and then I have my y-axis, what kind of data do I want to chart. All right, you could have month on month, so you can have multiple sets of data on your y-axis. All right, and then all the other things are more of a UI sense. What kind of UI am I showing? That's all. Like say border color, background color, is it filled? How thick the borders are. Okay, so those are some things that you can do with your dashboard. So other than that, I also inserted a video reference link. So this one was last week. So if you're not so sure about CRUD with Firebase real time, right, DB and web, so you can check those two videos out. All right, if there's any questions in those aspects, you can also let me know. The last thing that I want to do is this. Oh, yeah. Okay, first thing is if you have any kind of feedback, please add on to this mirror board, right? Something that you don't like, or this is anonymous, so I won't know who's writing. Something that's working out for you, please let me know. Something that's not working out and you wish that I did, please let me know also. All right. Okay, so the next thing I want you to take part as a class is this. Let me just change my Zoom. Class activity. So in this class activity, I want you to think about, right, in terms of data. Yeah, you guys have played a lot of games, seen a lot of data. In this, in this mirror board, all right, think about what kind of data do you want to display, or how you want to display. All right, in a dashboard, in a leaderboard, or in what kind of context that you have seen data being used. All right, you can also relate this back to in terms of VR, your VR idea, museum experience. So for example, you are doing a museum, to a museum create to a museum manager, curator, all right, curator. I want to know how many people played my VR application or experienced my museum in VR. Right, so I want to know the number of people touching base with it, number of people actually completing all the exhibits. So things like this are very crucial, and that's how you work with data, and that's how you can also implement into your assignment too. All right. So start filling in your thoughts. So this some of the data that some of the use case that the other two classes have written. So this will help you think more when it comes back to your assignment too. All right. So a few interesting ones are people using it for user chat. All right. Key data is like time taken, distance traveled. These two are like very commonly used and commonly seen. Win rate, lose rate, kill death ratios. Those are also important stats if you are having a game. All right, frequency of visit. This is also quite commonly seen as a dashboard. It's not seen so common in terms of a user's point of view, but an administrator point of view, that's quite important. All right, so try and fill in your ideas, and it's going to relate back to how you do your assignment also. All right, so please try.